It was the worst attack on a passenger airliner before the 9/11 attacks. 329 airline passengers, a majority of them Indian origin, were murdered as they were flying over the Atlantic. But 38 years later, history seems to be repeating itself, at least the circumstances around what happened in 1985. We decided to talk about the Kanishka bombing because Canada has once again become a hotbed of Khalistani separatism. Terrorists based in Canada have openly threatened Air India and Indian diplomats working in Canada and the UK. Now, joining me in the studio today is Sanjay Lazar, who lost his entire family in the Kanishka bombing. Sanjay, thank you for joining us on the News9 Plus show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm also joined by my colleagues Anthony Rosario and Deepak Badana. Anthony produced this fine documentary on the bombing of Kanishka. But Sanjay, I want to start by asking you, nearly 4 decades after that bombing of Kanishka, have you been able to get closure on that story, on that case?
Well, first of all, thank you again for having me. No, there has been no closure. As you would know that, it's been a long series of miscalculated mishaps. The government of Canada in those days, had advance notice. There was a surveillance going on. They botched it.
Yes.
They had tape recordings. They erased it. So, this was a tragedy that should never have happened. After that, it took 20 years to get somebody to court. And then because of, mishandling of the case, death of witnesses and, discrediting evidence or just casting it aside, the murderers walked free. And now, after that, we had the John Major inquiry and a lot of recommendations came out of that, but still no justice. So, no, it's been 38 years and no closure. And, we are heading into the 40th anniversary in a year or two. It's terrible.
Yeah. So, Anthony, 38 years, no closure, as Sanjay just said. It's horrific, the kind of lapses that we saw in the documentary, that very fine documentary that you produced and of course Aditya reported. But you belong to that generation, Anthony, that was born after this bombing. What kind of a voyage of discovery was it for you when you went over all this, that, Sanjay's testimonies and of course the investigation reports, where a bunch of Keystone cops seem to have been, investigating the terrorists before they bombed Kanishka?
First of all, Sandeep, thank you so much for having me on the show. I want to talk about the fact that, when I was growing up, when I was in school, I was and I'm still very fond of a show on Nat Geo called Air Crash Investigations.
Yes.
I watched a lot of it. Surprisingly, I've never heard about Kanishka before this.
Yeah.
It was only when we started discussing and only when I started reading about it, then did I learn what exactly happened. I think in our books also, we've never really, in our history books or in our contemporary history books, we've never read about it. And not only us Indians, it's also a Canadian tragedy. It's one of the biggest Canadian tragedies,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
And there was a survey a couple of years back. And according to that survey in Canada, 9 out of 10 people haven't even heard about this. Now, mind you, all of this was planned in Canada.
Yeah.
The flights that were bombed, the bag which carried the bombs was sent from Canada.
Yes.
And from people who were in Canada. So it's very surprising that people in India, but not surprising that people in Canada don't know about it, because Canada has been all about suppressing information.
Yes.
First, not divulging information, then suppressing information. It's a major cover-up, right?
Right.
So I think while I'm surprised that Indians don't know it, I'm not surprised that Canadians don't know it, because the Canadian government has made every effort to suppress it over the last so many years.
Absolutely. And Sanjay, they had good reason to suppress this because of the kind of botched up investigation that was conducted after, and indeed the, leading up to this. Well, as someone who's lost his entire family in this botched up investigation and intelligence failure of the magnitude of possibly 9/11, where, I mean, let's not forget in 9/11, they didn't know that they were planning to fly, airliners into buildings. But here, they were on the tail of these bombers as bomb makers, as Sanjay pointed out. They were actually exploding these bombs and the investigators were following them and didn't have a clue. How angry are you, Sanjay, at this? And given the light that Khalistanis continue to be, active and preaching hatred even today.
That's the biggest tragedy. That I lost my entire family is a catastrophe, yes, of course. And we lost, 331 people in Tokyo and in Ireland on that day.
Yes.
Is a great, huge. It's still today the world's largest aviation, bombing.
Yes.
If you take any single aircraft, and what made it worse was, like you say, they tracked the guys, they watched them test fire a bomb, they had wiretaps, they had everything. It makes me wonder whether they had somebody inside that organization,
right,
and which is why they just, closed their eyes to what was happening. What is very significant, which I've mentioned, I think, to Anthony as well, was 15 days before this bombing took place, the US Secret Service visited the Parmar residence with the RCMP,
right,
because Rajiv Gandhi was coming to the US. So they already knew these guys were up to no good.
right.
And there is a tail of warnings which
Yeah.
the Indian government has issued 26 or 30 aid memoirs
Yeah.
to the Canadian government saying, listen, we know there's going to be a major attack on an
Right.
Indian installation.
Yeah.
So either it's the consulate or it's the State Bank of India or Air India. These are the three big things. So of course I'm angry. Of course, I feel these guys should have been in jail for life. I feel we botched up the investigation. They could not prevent it, and they could not convict them.
Right.
That's the worst tragedy. And like Anthony says, yes, in India, unfortunately, when it happened, of course, Rajiv Gandhi did take it up. But after that, there has been no recognition of that, the magnitude of that disaster in India.
Yeah.
And there are 4 memorials all across Canada, and not a single one in India. We have pandered or allowed the Khalistani radicals to get away with too much.
Yes.
And I hope that the Indian government takes cognizance of this right now, because you can see the Khalistanis are now getting bolder and bolder in Canada.
Yeah,
They
exactly.
control the narrative there.
Yes,
So
and
that's
I want to bring in
dangerous.
Deepak on this, because Deepak has been reporting and producing this fine series called Khalistan Reborn. Deepak, what Sanjay just mentioned, the fact that the Khalistanis are regrouping again in Canada and they're kind of openly preaching hatred, how worrisome is that, given the kind of terrorism, lone wolf attacks that we are seeing? How worrisome is that?
I mean, there's definitely a possibility. You have to see that for decades now, a culture has been sustained where these acts have been glorified. You see tableaus of assassinations
Of the Prime Minister,
of the Prime
Indira
Minister
Gandhi,
of
no
India,
less.
of a head of state.
Yes.
So those tableaus, and they're not going through some ghetto, they're going
Yeah.
through the boulevards of the big cities
Yes.
of Canada. Then you have the Canadian government. At one point, they look at this community as a vote bank that can be exploited. At another way, as Mr. Miluski points out,
Yes.
somehow they look at these people as lesser Canadians.
Yes.
So even if the 320 odd Canadians who died
right.
in the aircraft, even if they died, it didn't really bother them.
Yes.
It is worth asking, had it been white, Caucasian people in that flight,
Yes.
what would the response
That's a
have
very
been?
interesting point, Deepak, because just a few weeks back we did this story on 26/11, where we had none other than the former NSA, MK Narayanan, telling us that the Americans knew about the attacks, but they were very selective in the kind of intelligence they were giving us. And had we been given all the intel, we would have possibly averted the attacks, the most horrific terror attacks in terms of size, magnitude, and all of that. Sanjay, is there a kind of an apartheid when it comes to terror? White terror, terrorist attacks that affect white people vis-a-vis terrorist attacks that kill brown people?
I said this 20 years ago. I first said this at the first anniversary. And incidentally, Terry had interviewed me after the bombing,
Yes.
after the trial. And I told him, if this was a plane full of Caucasians, white men,
Yes.
the the killers would have been in jail within 1 year.
Right.
It's because we were all brown, you know,
Yes.
and that is a glowing fact. Remember, Canada in the late 80s or the mid 80s was still a very white nation.
Yes.
The police, the RCMP, the CSIS, all had, you know, large numbers of Caucasians and very few Asians or Indians.
Yes.
Even when you go through the judgment of Justice Josephson, the reasons he gives for not accepting the testimony of Mrs. D and Mrs. E
Yes.
are so sketchy. It shows a complete lack of understanding of Indian culture, you know, of Sikh culture, and it's shameful. It's yeah, there is apartheid. Yes, to put it in one word.
It's shameful, and I mean that's a new layer that we've kind of uncovered on this.
News 9 Plus. Download now.